Have you ever looked at your own blood and realized they are strangers holding a hidden knife? I thought family was a safe harbor until a cold Seattle morning when one wrong phone tore down 10 years of lies. They thought I was a busy fool. They assumed I would never notice. But they forgot one thing. When you back a woman with nothing to lose into a corner, she does not weep. She levels everything. Hello, welcome back to Haley Revenge Stories. Sadly, YouTube has disabled our monetization, leaving us with no budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our staff for their livelihood and continue creating these stories for you. You can do this by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen or clicking the link in the description or comments. My name is Lucy Taylor. I am 34 years old, and I work as the Director of Crisis Management at Aegis Horizon Logistics. I handle massive disasters for a living. Whether it is a catastrophic supply chain collapse, a corporate public relations nightmare, or a fleet derailment in the dead of winter, I am the one they call to fix it. I am paid to stay calm while everything else burns. But absolutely nothing in my professional training prepared me for the quiet, devastating crisis brewing right inside my own childhood home. It all started on a freezing Tuesday morning in Seattle. The rain was coming down in thick, relentless sheets, beating aggressively against the windows of my father's house. I was running incredibly late for an emergency flight to our Alaska branch. A major logistical failure had occurred overnight, and my executive team needed me on the ground immediately. I was frantically tearing through the kitchen, fueled by only 2 hours of sleep and cold coffee. "I have to go, Dad," I shouted toward the hallway, wrestling my trench coat over my shoulders. I had just hugged my younger sister Chloe in the living room exactly 5 minutes earlier. She had smiled her perfect practice smile, sipping her matcha latte, and sweetly telling me to have a safe flight. In my panicked rush to find my car keys and confirm my cab arrival, I hastily swiped my sleek black company phone off the kitchen island. Or so I thought. I grabbed my bag, threw open the heavy oak door, and dashed out into the downpour. I threw myself into the back of the waiting yellow cab, my clothes damp. The driver slammed on the gas pedal tires, hissing loudly against the flooded asphalt. Inside the car, the rhythm of the windshield wipers was a harsh mechanical sound. Thwack, thwack, thwack. I leaned my head back against the seat, closing my eyes, trying to mentally prepare for the corporate chaos waiting for me up in Anchorage. Then the device in the pocket of my coat vibrated. It rang out with a sharp, generic tone. I pulled it out, feeling a surge of annoyance that work was already hunting me down. But when I looked at the glowing screen, it did not show my boss's name. It showed a single word: Chloe. Why was my younger sister calling my work line? I had literally just walked away from her. Frowning, I swiped the green icon and brought the cold glass screen to my ear. I opened my mouth to speak, ready to ask if I had forgotten my umbrella. I never got the chance to utter a single syllable. "Is she gone?" The voice that came through the tiny speaker was completely unrecognizable. It was not the sweet, caring tone my sister had used just 5 minutes ago. It was sharp. It was incredibly cold. It was dripping with a sick, twisted sense of relief. Before my exhausted brain could even process the drastic shift in her demeanor, she kept going. "Good. We move the money tonight before she finds out." My lungs suddenly forgot how to pull in oxygen. The damp air in the back of the cab instantly felt heavy and suffocating. I froze completely. My pulse skyrocketed, my heart hammering violently against my ribs, syncing perfectly with the frantic, rhythmic slashing of the cab's windshield wipers. Thump swish, thump swish. The reality hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. She thought she was talking to our dad, Arthur. I was holding Arthur's phone. We both had identical black cases for our devices. In my frantic morning haste, I had grabbed his phone off the counter instead of my own. As the dead silence stretched on my end of the line, the screen illuminated brightly against my cheek. I slowly pulled the device away and looked down. A text message banner dropped down from the very top of the screen. It was from my own personal phone number. My dad was texting his own phone using my device. The glaring white letters read, "You took my phone by mistake." A normal person would have immediately told the cab driver to turn the car around. A normal daughter would have rushed back to the house to swap the phones, apologizing for the silly morning mix-up. But I was not just a daughter anymore. I was a crisis manager, and my honed instincts were screaming louder than the Seattle storm outside that a massive catastrophe had just breached my inner perimeter. The money. What money? Before she finds out. Who was she? Me. I stared blankly at the glowing screen. I did not tell the driver to turn around. Instead, I pressed the side button and ended the call, silencing the device entirely. My hands were shaking, but my mind was locking into an icy, calculated focus. I typed in the familiar 4-digit passcode I knew my dad had used since we were little kids. The screen instantly unlocked. I was not going back. I was going to find out the truth. The cabin of the commercial airliner was dim-filled with the steady, droning hum of the jet engines as we cruised at 35,000 feet. The flight to Anchorage was long enough to provide the exact kind of isolated, uninterrupted time I needed. I sat in my window seat, ignoring the complimentary beverage service, my eyes glued to the small, glowing screen in my hands. The heavy dread that had settled in my stomach during the cab ride was now metamorphosing into a sharp, clinical chill. I was trained to look at the worst-case scenarios, to map out the damage, to find the hidden liabilities. I applied that exact same methodology to the device resting in my palms. I knew how to dissect a disaster. I just never expected the disaster to be my own life. I opened the mail application. The search bar blinked, waiting for a command. I typed in my late mother's name, then the name of her old tech startup. Growing up, my father had always painted a very specific, tragic picture of that venture. He told us that Mom's company had gone completely bankrupt shortly after she passed away, leaving us with absolutely nothing but fond memories and a box of worthless paper certificates. I had mourned that loss deeply, not for the financial security, but for her legacy and her hard work. The search results populated instantly. My breath hitched in my throat. There was a long archived chain of emails from a massive corporate acquisition firm dated exactly 4 years ago. I opened the oldest thread. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, the transfer agreements, and the final settlement figures. The company had not gone bankrupt at all. It had been quietly acquired by a global conglomerate. The shares my mother had left behind, the ones that were explicitly supposed to be split equally between her 2 daughters in a joint trust, had been liquidated. The total buyout was for several $million. Several $million. I read the words on the screen again and again, ensuring the dim cabin lighting was not playing tricks on my vision. It was entirely real. The money had been deposited into a private wealth management account, an account controlled entirely by Arthur. My hands remained perfectly steady as I switched from the email application to the text messages. I opened the thread with Chloe. I scrolled back. Months and months of messages unfolded like a grotesque, perfectly scripted stage play. Chloe's entire existence in Los Angeles was a carefully curated, heavily funded lie. She posed online as a successful, self-made entrepreneur, constantly posting about her luxury wellness brand and her glamorous lifestyle. But the texts told the real story. Every time her business bled cash, every time she needed to cover the exorbitant rent for her penthouse in West Hollywood, or buy a new designer wardrobe for a networking event, she texted our father. And he transferred the funds without hesitation. He was bleeding my mother's legacy dry to finance Chloe's delusions of grandeur. "Dad, the suppliers are threatening to pull out. I need $50,000 by tomorrow or I am ruined," one frantic text from Chloe read. "Taken care of, sweetie. The wire will clear in the morning. Just breathe. I have got you," Arthur had replied. The nausea hit me in a violent rolling wave. I felt physically sick, my stomach churning with the plane's slight turbulence. But it was the next exchange, buried a few weeks back, that truly shattered whatever fragile illusion of a family I had left. Chloe had written, "I feel guilty sometimes. What if Lucy finds out half of that was supposed to be hers? She is going to kill us. Arthur's response was a masterclass in paternal betrayal. Do not worry about your sister. I will always protect you. Lucy is too strong. She is practically made of iron. She can take care of herself. She has her big corporate job. She does not need this money. You do. She does not need this money. The words echoed in my head, mocking me with their vicious cruelty. I closed my eyes and leaned back against the headrest, letting the memories wash over me. I thought about my 20s. I thought about the crushing, suffocating weight of my student loans. I remembered working 80 hours a week, surviving on cheap coffee and instant noodles, crying out of pure exhaustion in the bathroom stalls of my first entry-level corporate job. I remembered the panic attacks in my tiny, unheated studio apartment when the utility bills piled up. I remembered begging Arthur for a small loan to cover a medical bill, only to be met with a solemn lecture about the importance of financial independence and pulling myself up by my own bootstraps. All those years while I was drowning in debt and grinding my bones to dust to build a stable life, they were sitting on a mountain of wealth that rightfully belonged to me. They watched me struggle. They watched me suffer. And they justified their theft by calling me strong. A hot, searing rage ignited deep in my chest. It was not a chaotic, explosive anger. It was something far more dangerous. It was absolute clarity. The tears that normally accompany a broken heart did not come. Instead, a cold, methodical blueprint began to form in my mind. If I confronted them right now, they would deny it. They would scramble to hide the assets offshore. They would play the victims and try to gaslight me into thinking I was crazy. I could not let that happen. I needed to let them feel safe. I needed to let them think their secret was still buried. When the plane finally touched down on the frozen runway in Anchorage, I did not storm off the aircraft and call the police. I did not scream into the phone. I walked calmly through the busy terminal, found an overnight shipping kiosk, and carefully placed the black phone into a heavily padded envelope. I paid the exorbitant priority fee to have it expedited directly to Arthur's front door in Seattle. Then I pulled my personal phone from my pocket, connected to the airport wireless network, and sent a message to my father. I kept my tone breezy, perfectly mimicking the oblivious, overworked daughter they relied on me to be. I am so sorry, Dad. I was in such a rush this morning I did not even notice I grabbed the wrong device. The phone is on its way home. Love you. I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The game had changed entirely. They thought they were playing me, but they had just handed me the rulebook. The moment my boots hit the freezing pavement in Anchorage, my personal crisis was neatly compartmentalized. I spent the first 48 hours doing exactly what my company paid me to do. I stabilized the regional supply chain, terminated an incompetent logistics manager, and restructured the distribution routes. I was a machine of pure corporate efficiency. But the exact second I returned to my sterile hotel room on Wednesday evening, the machine pivoted its focus. I needed a professional. I needed someone completely disconnected from the wealthy Seattle banking circles where my father played golf and drank scotch with wealth managers. I found an independent forensic accountant operating out of a small, discreet office in downtown Anchorage. His name was Elias, a quiet man who specialized in corporate embezzlement and hidden asset tracking. I paid his exorbitant retainer in cash, handed him a secure encrypted drive containing every single email and text message I had pulled from Arthur's device, and gave him one very clear directive: follow the blood trail. 2 days later, Elias asked me to meet him at a quiet, dimly lit diner on the industrial outskirts of the city. He slid a thick blue manila folder across the sticky laminate table. The smell of bitter black coffee and stale fried food hung heavy in the air. But my entire universe narrowed down to the stark reality printed on those pages. Your father is not just a thief, Elias said softly, tapping a manicured finger against a photocopied legal document. He is a felon. Elias methodically explained the mechanics of the theft. The original trust established by my mother was absolutely ironclad. It explicitly mandated that any liquidation transfer or disbursement of the acquired shares required the physically notarized signatures of both beneficiaries. That meant Arthur could not touch a single cent without my direct, legally binding consent. Yet 4 years ago, millions of dollars had seamlessly flowed out of the trust and into his private sole proprietor accounts. Elias turned the page. Look at the signature line from the primary release authorization dated exactly 4 years ago. I stared at the black ink on the white paper. There was my name, Lucy Taylor, scrawled in a flowing cursive loop that looked terrifyingly and convincingly like mine. But I knew exactly where I was on the specific date printed next to that signature. I was in Tokyo negotiating a massive shipping contract for my logistics firm. I had never seen this piece of paper in my life. Arthur had forged my signature. But the independent accountant was not finished. He had dug much deeper into the acquiring conglomerate's public financial filings. The reason for my family's sudden frantic panic was now crystal clear. The massive parent company that bought my mother's startup was initiating a comprehensive 10-year retroactive audit of all past acquisitions and mergers. The Internal Revenue Service and corporate compliance officers were preparing to comb through every single piece of historical paperwork. If that stolen money is still sitting in domestic accounts tied to the original forged transfer, Elias explained, his voice dropping to a whisper, the auditors will flag the massive discrepancy. The federal government will inevitably get involved. The only way your father and sister survive this audit is if they launder the remaining funds through an offshore shell company before the audit officially launches next. Monday morning, they are desperately trying to make the money disappear so the paper trail goes completely cold. Everything clicked into perfect, terrifying place. The rushed phone call I had intercepted in the taxi. Chloe's panicked voice talking about moving the money. They were racing against a ticking federal clock. Right on cue, as if summoned by my realization, my personal phone vibrated violently against the diner table. The screen displayed Arthur's name. I took a deep, steadying breath, smoothing my facial expression into a mask of calm, even though he could not see me, and answered the call. "Hi, Dad." I said, my voice perfectly pitched to sound exhausted but affectionate. "Lucy, my sweet girl," Arthur replied. His tone was dripping with that warm paternal honey I had trusted implicitly for over 3 decades. "How is the frozen north? Are you working yourself into the ground again? You really need to take a break, honey. You push yourself too hard." "Just surviving the corporate chaos, Dad. What is going on?" "Oh, nothing major at all," he said casually. Far too casually for a man facing federal prison. "I was just doing some early spring cleaning in my home office and found an old backlogged tax form from your mother's estate. The accountant says we just need your quick signature to close the file permanently. It is just boring bureaucratic nonsense, but you know how the government is. I will email it over to you right now. If you could just electronically sign it tonight, it would save your old dad a massive headache." "Sure thing, Dad. Send it over." I hung up the phone. Less than 1 minute later, my screen chimed with a text message from Chloe. "Hey, sis. Dad said he is sending over some boring tax paper for Mom's old stuff. He is stressing out about it. Could you just sign it quickly so he can relax? You know how his blood pressure gets when he worries about legal paperwork. Love you, miss you." The performance was sickeningly Oscar-worthy. They were flawlessly playing the roles of the caring father and the loving concerned sister, all while actively trying to push me in front of a legal freight train. I opened the secure attachment Arthur had emailed. I did not just read it, I dissected it with the precision of a surgeon. Hidden beneath thick layers of dense, convoluted tax jargon and formatting tricks was a single devastating paragraph. It was a retroactive liability waiver. By signing it, I would legally acknowledge and approve of all past financial transfers from the trust. I would be retroactively authorizing the forgery. I would legally become an accomplice to my own robbery. I took a slow sip of my cold coffee. I opened the family group chat and typed out a reply. Hey guys, I tried to open the document, but the corporate firewall here at the Anchorage office is completely blocking external PDF attachments. Our entire network is down for a massive unannounced security update. I will not be able to access my personal email or sign anything until I fly back to Seattle tomorrow night. Sorry for the delay. The digital silence that followed my message was absolutely deafening. I could practically feel the suffocating, desperate panic gripping them all the way from the West Coast. I had successfully stalled their offshore transfer. The trap was officially baited, and they had absolutely no choice but to wait for me to come home and spring it. I intentionally requested an emergency personal leave from my corporate directors and boarded a commercial flight back to Seattle. I spent the entire journey perfectly crafting my armor. By the time my taxi pulled up to the familiar suburban driveway, I had fully slipped into the persona they desperately needed to see. I was the exhausted, overworked corporate executive who barely had enough mental bandwidth to remember her own address. I walked through the heavy front door, rolling my shoulders, sighing heavily, and rubbing my temples as if the immense weight of a global supply chain crisis was still crushing my skull. The dining room was staged with absolute sickening perfection. The air was thick with the rich, savory aroma of slow-roasted beef tenderloin, which had always been my absolute favorite childhood meal. Arthur was pulling a golden tray of roasted vegetables from the oven, wearing an apron over his crisp, button-down shirt. Chloe was already standing by the long mahogany dining table, uncorking a bottle of incredibly expensive red wine. I recognized the label immediately. It was a rare vintage from 2012 that cost easily $500 a bottle. My younger sister, the supposedly struggling entrepreneur, poured the dark ruby liquid into crystal glasses with a smile so wide and brightly manufactured it looked physically painful. "Lucy, you made it!" Chloe practically sang out, rushing across the room to pull me into a tight embrace. The smell of her heavy designer perfume almost made me gag. "We were so worried about you working yourself to death up there in the freezing cold." "Just another week in logistics," I replied, offering a tired, convincing smile. I took my assigned seat at the table. The dinner that followed was a masterclass in psychological torture. The room felt entirely devoid of oxygen. Every bite of the tender beef tasted like ash in my mouth. We exchanged pleasantries about the weather. We talked about Chloe's fictitious business ventures. Arthur constantly refilled my wine glass, praising my work ethic, his eyes radiating a false, deeply unsettling warmth. It was a grotesque pantomime of a happy, loving family. I played my part flawlessly, nodding along, laughing at their perfectly rehearsed jokes, all while staring at the two people who had actively conspired to steal my future. As the dinner plates were finally being cleared away, Arthur casually wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and reached over to the nearby wooden credenza. He picked up a thin cream-colored manila folder and slid it smoothly across the polished mahogany surface toward me. "I know you are utterly exhausted, sweetie," Arthur said, his voice dripping with gentle concern. "But since you are here, let us just get this silly administrative nonsense out of the way. It is just that old tax release form we talked about on the phone. I have my silver pen right here. If you could just sign on the bottom line, I can finally drop this off at the lawyer's office tomorrow at 9 o'clock in the morning and close the estate file forever." I picked up the heavy silver pen. I pulled the folder closer and flipped it open. I did not just sign it. I leaned back in my chair, holding the thick paper up to the warm chandelier light, pretending to casually skim the paragraphs. In reality, my eyes darted directly to the dense legal block at the bottom of the second page. There it was. The retroactive indemnity clause. It was camouflaged brilliantly under layers of standard tax jargon, but its malicious purpose was blindingly clear. One stroke of this pen, and I would legally absorb all responsibility for their theft. I would be legally stating that I approved the forged signature from 4 years ago. The dining room went completely silent. The only sound was the heavy rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I could feel the intense burning weight of their stares boring into the top of my head. They were holding their breath. I held the pen hovering over the signature line for 5 agonizingly long seconds. Then I let it drop. It hit the table with a sharp, echoing clatter. I slowly closed the folder and rested my folded hands on top of it. I looked up and gave them a warm, completely apologetic smile. "I am so sorry, Dad," I said, keeping my voice light and breezy. "But my corporate counsel gave me a very strict piece of advice years ago, and I have made it a hard personal rule. I never sign any legally binding document after 8 o'clock at night. My brain is just entirely fried from the travel. I will look it over properly with my morning coffee." The manufactured warmth vanished from the room in an instant. The delicate silence shattered. Panic flashed wildly behind Chloe's perfectly manicured eyelashes. Her polite mask slipped, revealing the terrified, cornered animal hiding underneath. "Are you serious right now?" Chloe demanded, her voice suddenly shrill and rising a full octave. She slammed her wine glass down hard, splashing red liquid onto the pristine white tablecloth. "It is a standard piece of paper. Lucy, Dad has been stressing out over this for weeks. You are always so paranoid and incredibly selfish. You work 80 hours a week for a massive corporation. But you cannot take 5 seconds to do one simple thing to help our father. You do not care about him at all." Arthur raised a shaking hand, trying to calm her, his own face rapidly draining of color. "Now, Chloe, let your sister rest." I did not raise my voice. I did not engage with her childish, desperate tantrum. I simply pushed my heavy wooden chair back and stood up. I picked up the cream-colored folder, sliding it firmly under my arm. "You are right, Chloe," I said, my tone completely flat, devoid of any emotion whatsoever. "I am incredibly tired. Thank you for the wonderful dinner. I am going to head up to my old room and get some sleep." I turned my back on them and walked slowly out of the dining room. I did not look over my shoulder, but I did not need to. I could practically hear their panicked, trembling breaths. I walked up the hardwood stairs, holding the exact piece of physical evidence that proved their desperate guilt, leaving behind 2 shattered liars whose perfectly constructed facade had just begun to violently crack. The sun had barely crested the Seattle skyline on Thursday morning when my secure phone vibrated on the hotel nightstand. I had not stayed at my father's house after the disastrous dinner. I had driven straight to a downtown suite, turning it into a temporary war room. On the line was the lead attorney from the private legal team I had retained the day prior. "We have a confirmed timeline," the attorney stated crisply through the encrypted connection. "The parent company's internal compliance division has officially scheduled the retroactive audit freeze. If those specific trust funds are not entirely liquidated and transferred out of the current domestic accounts by exactly 10 o'clock on Friday morning, the federal holds will automatically lock every single asset connected to your father's Social Security number. The window is closing rapidly." 10 o'clock on Friday morning. That was the absolute hard deadline. My family knew it too. By noon on Thursday, their manufactured patience had completely disintegrated. My phone screen lit up with a relentless barrage of frantic texts from Chloe and multiple missed calls from Arthur. They could no longer afford the luxury of pretending this was just a casual, unimportant tax errand. Finally, Arthur left a desperate, breathy voicemail demanding we meet at his private wealth management firm in the financial district that very afternoon to, as he put it, resolve this incredibly frustrating family misunderstanding once and for all. I agreed instantly. I spent the next 2 hours meticulously assembling my weapon. It was not a gun or a knife. It was a thick, heavy black binder. Inside its leather covers lay the absolute destruction of their entire lives. The first section contained the forensic analysis from Elias, proving without a shadow of a doubt that my signature had been criminally forged 4 years ago. The second section held the exhaustive banking logs tracking every single dollar Arthur had illegally funneled to Los Angeles to fund Chloe's pathetic, fabricated lifestyle. And the final section was the most devastating. It was a fully completed, officially stamped whistleblower report prepared by my legal team, ready to be submitted directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I arrived at the high-end wealth management office 20 minutes before the scheduled meeting. The building was a towering monument to corporate greed, all sleek glass-polished marble floors and silent, incredibly fast elevators. The receptionist escorted me into a massive corner conference room overlooking the gray, choppy waters of Puget Sound. I immediately set the stage for my final performance. I slumped into a heavy leather chair at the far end of the long mahogany table. I let my shoulders drop forward intentionally, messing up my hair slightly to look entirely disheveled. I rubbed my temples with both hands, closing my eyes, projecting the exact image of a thoroughly defeated, exhausted corporate drone who simply wanted the relentless, agonizing family drama to end. Exactly at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy glass doors swung open. Arthur and Chloe walked in, flanked by a slick, overly tanned wealth manager wearing a bespoke suit that probably cost $10,000. Chloe took one look at my slumped posture, and a cruel, triumphant smirk instantly blossomed across her perfectly contoured face. She genuinely believed she had won. She looked at me not as a sister, but as a weak, easily manipulated puppet who had finally broken under the extreme pressure. Arthur let out a long, highly audible sigh of relief, his tense shoulders relaxing as he hurried to take the seat directly across from me. "I am so glad you decided to be reasonable, Lucy," Arthur said, his voice returning to that sickeningly sweet, patronizing tone. He pulled the familiar cream-colored folder from his leather briefcase and slid it smoothly across the table toward me, accompanied by a heavy, expensive gold pen. "We just need to get this finalized today so we can all move on with our lives." The wealth manager cleared his throat, opening his own silver laptop. "Good afternoon, Miss Taylor. To ensure full compliance with international transfer regulations, I am required to record the verbal authorization of this document before we initiate the outbound wire. Is that acceptable to you?" I kept my eyes cast downward, staring blankly at the gold pen resting on the polished wood. I gave a slow, defeated nod. Whatever it takes to just be done with this. The manager smiled warmly, pressing a silver button on a small, sleek audio recorder sitting in the center of the table. A tiny red light blinked to life. "Excellent," the manager said smoothly. "For the official record, this meeting is to finalize the retroactive liability waiver and authorize the immediate transfer of the remaining trust assets to a secure offshore holding account. Miss Taylor, if you will just sign the bottom of page 2, we can finalize the movement of these millions of dollars outside the United States border today." The red light blinked steadily. The trap was perfectly set. The federal deadline was ticking down, and my father pushed the gold pen exactly 1 inch closer to my right hand. I reached out with my right hand and wrapped my fingers around the cold, heavy barrel of the solid gold pen. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath. The slick wealth manager leaned forward slightly in his expensive chair, his eyes fixed on the signature line. Chloe was practically vibrating with barely contained excitement, a greedy, victorious gleam dancing in her eyes. Arthur exhaled a long, shaky breath of pure relief, believing that his decade of deceit was finally about to be buried forever. The tiny red light on the audio recorder blinked in the center of the table, capturing the absolute silence of the room. I let the gold nib of the pen hover exactly 1 inch above the thick white paper of the liability waiver. I held it there for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Then I opened my fingers. The heavy gold pen dropped from my grip. It hit the polished mahogany table with a sharp, violent clack that echoed off the glass walls like a gunshot. It rolled lazily across the wood and fell off the edge, tumbling down onto the carpeted floor. Before anyone could even register the sound, I reached down into my leather tote bag, resting beside my chair. I pulled out the massive, heavy black binder I had assembled that morning. I slammed it down directly on top of Arthur's pathetic cream-colored folder, entirely covering the fraudulent document. I did not look at my father or my sister. I turned my eyes directly to the blinking red light of the audio recorder. My voice was no longer the soft, exhausted tone of a defeated daughter. It was the razor-sharp, commanding voice of a corporate crisis manager dismantling a hostile threat. For the official audio record, I stated, clearly enunciating every single syllable into the microphone. My name is Lucy Taylor. I am formally stating that the original signature authorizing the liquidation of my mother's trust, dated exactly 4 years ago, is a criminal forgery. I did not sign that document. I was out of the country. The wealth manager's perfectly tanned face suddenly drained of all color. His mouth fell open, but no sound came out. I flipped open the heavy black binder. Furthermore, for the record, I have the complete audited transaction history of the stolen funds. I am looking at 52 separate wire transfers made over the last 48 months. These transfers moved millions of dollars from a domestic private wealth account into various fictitious corporate entities registered in Los Angeles, California, to fund the fraudulent lifestyle of my sister, Chloe Taylor. Chloe gasped loudly, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. She violently pushed her chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the floor. "Shut up! Lucy, shut your mouth right now." I ignored her completely. I turned a page in the binder and looked directly at the wealth manager, who was now sweating profusely through his expensive suit. "And finally," I continued, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register, "I have the routing information for the specific offshore account you were attempting to move the remaining stolen funds into today. It is a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, a maneuver explicitly designed to hide assets from an impending federal corporate audit." The wealth manager did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. The instinct for legal self-preservation overrode everything else. He lunged across the polished table, his hands shaking violently, and smashed his finger down on the silver button of the audio recorder. The blinking red light died instantly. He practically threw himself backward out of his leather chair, holding both of his hands up in the air, as if the table itself had suddenly caught fire. "I have absolutely no knowledge of any forgery," the manager stammered loudly, his voice cracking with sheer panic. He began backing away toward the glass doors. "My firm operates strictly on the provided documentation. If there is a dispute of ownership or allegations of federal money laundering, I am legally obligated to terminate this relationship immediately. This meeting is over. We will not process any outbound international wires." Arthur jumped up from his seat. His face flushed a deep, dangerous purple. He reached out frantically toward the retreating manager. "Wait. Please do not do this. We can explain everything. She is just confused. She is overworked." I closed the black binder with a loud, definitive thud. "No one is confused, Arthur," I said coldly. The use of his first name stopped him dead in his tracks. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his eyes wide with a sudden dawning horror. "You thought the deadline to move the money was 10 o'clock tomorrow morning." I told them, watching the reality of their destruction finally set in. But I do not wait for deadlines. I dictate them. At exactly 8 o'clock this morning, my private legal team delivered this exact binder to the parent company's internal compliance division. We also simultaneously filed a comprehensive whistleblower report with the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a structural collapse. Every single domestic account tied to your Social Security numbers, including the one holding the remainder of my mother's money, was officially frozen by federal mandate 3 hours ago. I finished. "You have absolutely nothing left." Chloe broke first. The facade of the glamorous, successful entrepreneur shattered into a million jagged pieces. Her face crumpled into a mask of ugly, naked panic. She let out a piercing, guttural shriek and whirled around to face Arthur. "You promised me," Chloe screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet office. Tears and heavy black mascara began pouring down her cheeks, staining her designer silk blouse. "You told me this was safe. You said you had it handled, you stupid old man. They are going to put me in prison. I'm going to lose my penthouse. You ruined my entire life." She did not care about him. She never had. In her moment of absolute ruin, all she cared about was the money and her fake image. She aggressively shoved Arthur in the chest, weeping hysterically, revealing the rotting, selfish core he had spent millions of dollars trying to protect. Arthur stumbled backward from her push. The fight completely drained out of his body. He looked at his screaming, hateful youngest daughter, and then he looked back at me. His legs seemed to simply give out. He collapsed. The proud, manipulative patriarch fell straight down onto his knees on the expensive office carpet. "Lucy!" He gasped, his voice a pathetic, wet wheeze. He held his shaking hands out toward me, tears spilling over his wrinkled cheeks. "Please, I am begging you. You have to call your lawyers. You have to withdraw the report. I only did it because Chloe is so fragile. She is so weak she could never survive in the real world. But you were always so independent. You are so strong. You never needed me." I stood up from my chair. I picked up my leather tote bag and slung it over my shoulder. I looked down at the man kneeling on the floor, weeping over the consequences of his own monstrous betrayal. I felt absolutely no anger anymore. I felt no sorrow. I felt nothing but a clean, sweeping emptiness that felt remarkably like freedom. "You are exactly right," I said, my voice light and entirely hollow. "I do not need you, and starting today, I do not need this family either." I turned my back on them. I walked straight toward the heavy glass doors. Behind me, Chloe was still screaming wildly, hurling vicious insults at the man on the floor, while Arthur sobbed openly, pleading to an empty room. I pushed the glass doors open and stepped out into the quiet hallway. I pressed the button for the elevator, rode it down to the ground floor, and walked out of the building. The Seattle rain had finally stopped, leaving the city streets washed clean. I took a deep breath of the crisp, cold air, leaving the wreckage entirely behind me. Hello, everyone. Thank you so very much from the bottom of my heart for listening to this story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let me know your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story entertaining and want to help our channel survive, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the direct PayPal link in the video description or the pinned comment. Your generous $1 support goes directly to paying our hardworking staff, so they can feed their families and continue bringing you more high-quality stories just like this one. Thank you again, and stay safe out there.